Two quiet farmers stood between a corrupt sheriff and a million-dollar land grab. What no one knew was they were Keanu Reeves and Steven Seagal. When the gang came to scare them off, the night exploded in fire, fists, and betrayal. But the real question is, what secret were these two legends hiding beneath their fields? Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The sun hadn't yet cleared the tree line when Keanu Reeves pushed open the barn doors. The wood groaned under his touch, the same way it had every morning for the past 3 years. The smell of hay, leather, and dew hit him all at once. Familiar, grounding. He paused there, in the slant of soft light, letting the breeze brush across his face. No cameras, no scripts, just silence and the simple creak of the world waking up. Out past the corral, Steven Seagal stood leaning against the rail fence, coffee thermos in one hand, the other resting on his hip. His gray hair caught the early light and his boots sank into the soft morning soil. The horses moved slowly in the pasture, tails swishing, hooves crunching dry grass. He didn't say anything at first, just took another long sip from the dented steel thermos they'd passed back and forth since the day they first arrived. "Fence needs tightening by the south end," Steven said finally, nodding toward a sagging corner where a post had begun to lean. Keanu stepped out, his denim shirt already damp with early sweat. "Could be worse. Could be rush hour on the 405. Steven chuckled low in his chest. Or a director yelling cut for the 50th time because he read one book on Aikido and thinks he's an expert. Keanu smiled faintly. "That's trauma I've chosen to forget." Their laughter didn't echo. It simply lived in the space between them, the kind of humor forged from years of bruises, both on screen and off. These days, it came slower, but it was real, and they knew what that was worth. The 60-acre farm wasn't much by Georgia standards. No high-tech machinery, no sprawling rows of produce for miles, but it was theirs. Every fence post, every shovel of dirt, every calloused handprint on the old cedar barn was part of a healing neither of them had expected to find. Keanu looked across the pasture at the rising sun pushing golden light over the hill, and for a brief moment, he let himself believe that peace could last. Steven stepped through the gate and joined him. "Heard from your agent lately?" Keanu scoffed. "I told her not to call unless the script came with a good villain and a better ending. And still sends me supplements, thinks I need to stay camera ready. I told her the only camera I care about now is the one on the gatepost." They stood there for a long beat, watching the horses graze. The wind brushed through the trees, and a hawk circled high overhead, its wings stretched wide. Everything felt still, settled, but both men knew better. Even silence has a pulse if you listen long enough. Steven wandered toward the barn, his hand dragging gently across the tall grass as he walked. Keanu followed, trailing just a step behind. They worked without words, muscle memory, unspoken routine. Every morning began this way. Clean the stalls, check the fence line, feed the horses, rotate the water barrels. There was something sacred in the rhythm, something almost holy in the quiet labor. In the dim barn light, Keanu hauled a bale of hay onto his shoulder. His back flexed under the strain, not quite as effortless as it once was, but steady. Steven swept the floor beside him, the broom worn down to the nub. Dust curled in the shafts of sunlight pouring through the slats in the roof. "You ever miss it?" Keanu asked after a while. Steven didn't have to ask what he meant. Not the noise, not the suits. Sometimes, the crowd. The roar after a good scene, the kind of silence that comes after a hit lands right. But not enough to go back. Keanu nodded. "Yeah, I miss the moments, but not the machine." There had been a time, years ago, when both men were household names, movie posters, red carpets, endless interviews. But with fame came the exhaustion, the shallow friendships, the betrayal of people who only cared about what you could give them. Keanu had walked away after one particularly brutal press tour that turned a personal tragedy into tabloid fodder. Steven left after a studio backed out of a contract and left him holding the blame. Neither spoke much about those days. The past had its place, but it didn't belong in the fields or the morning wind. They finished feeding the horses and walked out into the open air. The sun was higher now, warming the ground beneath their boots. Keanu stretched his arms over his head, shoulders cracking slightly. A pickup truck passed slowly on the gravel road in front of their property. A teenage boy leaned out the window, waving. Keanu raised a hand in return. The driver, a grizzled older man with a cigarette tucked in the corner of his mouth, just stared, then looked away. Steven noticed it too. Old man Grant still thinks we're frauds. Keanu shrugged. He'll believe what he wants. Doesn't change how we live. True, but there's a difference between being ignored and being targeted. That word hung in the air. Targeted. A word they hadn't had to say out loud yet, but both had been thinking. People in town had opinions. Some smiled, nodded, gave them homemade jam, or asked for help fixing their tractors. Others crossed the street when they walked by, and more than a few whispered behind backs, wondering why two former legends would bury themselves out here like ghosts. Keanu looked back at the barn, then out at the pasture. Let 'em whisper. They don't know the story. Steven exhaled slowly. They're about to find out. By mid-morning, Keanu was mending a fence post by hand, digging into the stubborn Georgia clay with a rusted spade. Steven knelt nearby, measuring out the slack in the barbed wire. They worked in a rhythm that didn't need words. Sweat dripping, boots sinking, the sun climbing higher above them. Birds chirped overhead, the kind that only sang when no machines were running. Funny, Steven muttered, wiping his forehead with the edge of his sleeve. All the fights we've been in, and this is what breaks my back. A crooked fence. Keanu grinned. You throw fewer punches now. Only when I have to. Keanu drove the post deeper, his hands wrapped in thick gloves. There's a peace in this. Honest work. No one to impress. No cameras watching. Just doing what needs to be done. Until someone decides they want it, Steven said flatly. Keanu stopped. The silence wrapped around them again. You feel that too? He asked. Steven nodded, eyes scanning the tree line. It's not just the stairs. It's the quiet, that kind that feels off. Like everyone's waiting for something to happen. A hawk cried in the distance. Keanu looked up at the sky, squinting against the glare. They finished setting the post and packed up their tools. Back at the farmhouse, the radio crackled with a country tune as they sat on the porch, drinking cold water from mismatched mason jars. The wood underfoot was smooth from years of wear, every board hammered in by their own hands. Their chairs creaked gently with every shift of weight. Steven broke the stillness. You ever regret not selling when we had the chance? Keanu stared out at the pasture, at the horses grazing by the fence they'd just repaired. Every day, and not once. Steven nodded slowly. Me neither. They knew what this place cost them, physically, emotionally, financially. But it gave something back, too. A place to breathe, a space to heal, a rhythm their bodies understood better than the chaos of studios and contracts. The world out there was noisy, but here they could hear themselves think. Down the road, a car passed again, slower this time, a dark sedan, windows tinted. No wave, just a long, measured look as it rolled by. Steven's hand curled slightly around his cup. That's the third time this week. Keanu didn't answer. He just watched until the car disappeared beyond the hill. They didn't speak for a while after that. The sun began to dip behind the barn, casting long shadows across the gravel driveway. The day was nearly over, but something in the air hadn't settled. There was weight to the breeze now. a sense that the quiet they'd worked so hard to build was being watched, measured, counted down. Keanu leaned back in his chair, his voice soft but firm. "This land gave us a second chance. I'm not giving it up without a fight." Steven didn't say a word. He just nodded. And they both sat there, waiting for the first crack in the silence. The next morning, Keanu and Steven were back at the fence line, working the far edge of the property near the tree grove. The sun was barely climbing, mist still hanging low over the field. Keanu hammered in a new crossbeam while Steven unwound the last roll of barbed wire, fingers gloved but stiff. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. The rhythm of work did the talking. The ground was soft from last night's brief storm, the kind that left everything just damp enough to stick to your boots. Keanu was adjusting the post tension when the sound of an old engine broke through the stillness. Steven looked up first. A beat-up red Ford truck rolled slowly up the gravel road and turned into the gate without hurry. The driver parked just shy of the tool shed and killed the engine. An old man stepped out. Thin, stooped, and wiry, with deep wrinkles and a ball cap pulled low. It was Ed Collier, their nearest neighbor. Lived about a mile west, kept a few goats and a small orchard. Keanu leaned his weight against the fence post as Ed approached. "Morning, Ed." "Morning, boys," Ed said, though the usual lightness in his tone wasn't there. His eyes flicked over his shoulder, then to the tree line behind them. "Got a minute?" Steven straightened, dusting his hands on his jeans. "Sure. Something wrong?" Ed nodded slowly. "Something's wrong, all right. I didn't drive out here for pleasantries." Keanu stepped down from the wooden brace and motioned to a bench near the shed. "Let's talk." They walked together in silence. Ed moved slower than he used to, but there was tension in his gait that had nothing to do with age. When he sat, he rubbed his hands together, knuckles red from arthritis and worry. "It's the Hendersons," Ed finally said. "You seen 'em lately?" Keanu shook his head. "Not since last week. Thought they were visiting family." "Didn't go to visit nobody," Ed replied. "They left. Middle of the night. House locked up tight, curtains drawn. Left half their furniture inside." Steven narrowed his eyes. "That doesn't sound like the Hendersons." "No, it doesn't," Ed said, voice low. "But it gets worse. Their livestock, sick as dogs. 3 goats dead, 2 horses foaming at the mouth. Tools smashed, barn door busted off the hinges. Same day they left." Keanu stayed quiet, jaw tightening slightly. "Some folks are whispering about Kyle Ransom," Ed continued. "You know the name?" Steven nodded. "Developer. Bought up some land out by Bell's Creek last year." Ed leaned forward, eyes darting like a man afraid the trees might be listening. "He's been making offers left and right. Anyone says no, well, things start going wrong. Property gets vandalized, livestock poisoned, just like the Hendersons." Steven crossed his arms. "You saying Ransom's behind it?" "I'm saying he's at the center of it, and rumor is Sheriff Halloran's looking the other way, maybe even helping." Keanu's gaze didn't waver. "You sure?" Ed shook his head. "I'm not sure of anything. That's what scares me." Steven glanced toward the road, where Ed's truck sat quiet under the sun. He didn't like the look in the old man's eyes. There was too much history behind them, too much fear. "You said folks are whispering," Steven said. "Anyone actually talk to the sheriff?" Ed snorted under his breath. "And say what, that we think a powerful man is tied to some developer poisoning goats and breaking barn doors? Ain't much a sheriff can't bury out here if he wants to. Especially one that don't like having his name in folks' mouths." Keanu sat on the bench beside him, elbows resting on his knees. "Ed, you've lived here your whole life. You've seen the town change. You think Halloran's dirty?" Ed rubbed his forehead, eyes squinting into the rising light. "Used to think he was just strict, the kind that cared more about order than people. But now? He's got new boots, a new truck, a badge that shines like it's never seen a real day's work, and a new best friend with deep pockets. That's what I see." Steven folded his arms. "And Ransom?" "Ransom," Ed said, spitting into the dirt, "is a man who smiles too wide and shakes your hand like he's already counting your money. He doesn't see land, he sees leverage." Keanu leaned back slightly. "You come out here just to tell us this?" Ed looked at him, something tired in his face. "No, I came to say be careful. Ransom's got his eye on County Road 14. That means you two. Folks say you won't sell. Makes you the next story at the diner." Steven's jaw flexed. "Let him talk." Ed stood slowly, knees popping as he straightened. "I'm not saying pack up and run. I know you boys. But just keep your heads up. This ain't the kind of trouble you can outfence or outfix." Keanu rose too, offering his hand. Ed shook it firmly. "Thanks, Ed," Keanu said. "Appreciate the warning." As Ed turned to leave, he paused at the edge of the gravel. "Thing about trouble? It doesn't knock on the front door anymore. It cuts your brake lines and lights your barn when you're asleep." Steven watched him drive off down the road until the red truck vanished around the bend. The breeze picked up, tugging at the fence wire and rustling the nearby pines. Keanu didn't move. "What do you think?" "I think Ed's telling the truth," Steven said. "Maybe not all of it, but enough to smell the smoke." Keanu stared down the road for a moment longer. "Let's not jump at ghosts." "I'm not," Steven replied. "But I know fear when I see it, and Ed's carrying more than rumors." The breeze shifted again, colder this time. The kind of wind that doesn't just move leaves. It carries warning. Keanu's voice was quiet. "Let's keep our eyes open. Sometimes rot starts beneath the floorboards." They got back to work, but the air had changed. Every swing of the hammer now felt heavier. Every glance toward the tree line lingered longer. The fence post that once felt like just another task now stood like a boundary between peace and something darker creeping in. Steven coiled the last length of barbed wire and slung it over his shoulder. Ed's not the type to stir panic. If he's talking, it's because something's already started. Keanu didn't answer. He just drove another nail into the brace, the wood splitting slightly under the pressure. "You still think it's just gossip?" Steven asked. "I think I've lived long enough to know fear doesn't always lie," Keanu said. "But I also know how fast rumors can eat a town alive." Steven walked toward the fence's edge, scanning the road beyond. "And if this one's more than talk?" Keanu finished the brace, wiped his hands on a rag, and joined him. "Then we deal with it, but not before we're sure." They stood side by side, quiet again. A hawk drifted overhead, the only sound the wind brushing through the dry grass and the soft creak of an old gate swinging in the breeze. There was no visible threat. No trucks parked across the road, no men in suits or badges watching from the shadows. But the unease stayed rooted deep, the kind that settles in the bones before it reaches the skin. A dog barked far off in the distance. Then, silence again. Steven finally broke it. "We didn't come here to fight another war, Keanu." "I know," Keanu said, eyes still scanning the horizon. "We came here to rest, to breathe, to do something honest." Keanu looked at him, his face unreadable. "And we still are. But honesty doesn't mean standing still when the wind shifts." Steven gave a slow nod. "No. It means knowing when to dig in." They gathered their tools and headed back toward the barn. The sun had crested above the ridge, casting longer shadows across the field. From the farmhouse porch, the flag above the railing flapped gently in the wind, its edges frayed but proud. As they reached the gravel path, Keanu paused and looked back at the road. He could still see the faint dust trail from Ed's truck, already fading into the distance. "Do you think the sheriff's really involved?" Steven asked quietly. "I don't know," Keanu replied. "But if he is, that changes everything." They walked the rest of the way in silence. Behind them, The fence stood tall and finished, gleaming slightly in the sun. But the breeze no longer felt clean. It carried something else now. A whisper, a warning. The Metron County Town Hall didn't look like much, just a squat red brick building with flickering lights and a parking lot full of dusty trucks. But that night, it felt like the center of a storm. Keanu and Steven pulled up just after 6, parking the old Chevy along the outer edge of the lot. They didn't speak as they stepped out, boots crunching gravel. The sky had that dry, golden hue that comes just before dusk, casting long shadows across the pavement. Inside, the meeting was already underway. The main hall was packed shoulder to shoulder. Farmers in ball caps, mothers with babies on their hips, high schoolers bored and scrolling their phones, and the usual cluster of county officials seated up front. Folding chairs creaked, ceiling fans buzzed. The air was thick with heat, and thicker still with tension. Keanu and Steven stepped inside together. A few heads turned. Some people nodded quietly, offering respectful glances. Others just stared, faces unreadable, and a few, especially near the back, leaned into each other with smirks, muttering under their breath. "Didn't think they still showed their faces in public," someone whispered. "Look who finally came down from the saddle." Keanu heard it all, but said nothing. He kept walking, Steven beside him, both men calm, solid, and unshaken. They found 2 empty seats near the middle row and sat down quietly. Keanu folded his hands in his lap. Steven kept his arms crossed, jaw set. At the front of the room, the councilman finished his speech about road repairs and handed the mic to a tall man in a tailored blue suit. His tie was too tight, his grin too wide, hair slicked back like it hadn't moved in a decade. Kyle Ransom. He stepped forward like he owned the room, and judging by the way a few people clapped, he almost did. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, holding out his arms like he was about to bless them, "thank you for letting me speak on a matter of importance. Not just to this county, but to the future of our children, our economy, and our progress." Keanu's eyes didn't move, but his attention sharpened. Ransom continued. "For far too long, land in this area has been underused. Potential wasted, opportunities missed. I've taken it upon myself to help revitalize this great county, starting with outdated, abandoned, and, let's call it what it is, squatter-owned properties." A murmur rolled through the crowd. Steven's fingers curled slowly. "And one such property," Ransom said, lifting a file in his hand, "sits on County Road 14, a tract of land that, based on my legal team's investigation, was never properly claimed. No real chain of title, no rightful deed, just 2 men playing farmer in the twilight of their careers." Keanu stood up, not rushed, not loud, and just stood. The room hushed. Even the ceiling fan seemed to go quieter. All eyes turned to Keanu as he reached into the inside pocket of his denim jacket and calmly pulled out a folded envelope. The thick, official kind. He walked slowly to the front of the room, his boots tapping softly against the tile. He faced Kyle Ransom without blinking, then held the envelope in the air for everyone to see. "These," Keanu said, his voice steady and clear, "are the original county-stamped deeds to the land on County Road 14. Purchased in full, filed with the clerk, dated 3 years ago. All legal, all traceable." He handed the papers to the nearest councilman, who hesitated, then took them and began flipping through. Murmurs rose from the crowd again, more confused now, less certain. Keanu turned back toward the audience. "Steven and I didn't inherit that land. We didn't squat on it. We paid for it. Worked it, built it up with our hands. Some of you have seen us out there, fixing fences, clearing brush. It may not be perfect, but it's honest." A beat of silence. Then Steven stood up too. "We've had our names twisted into jokes more times than I can count," he said, stepping forward, "and we don't care. But this?" What you just heard from Mr. Ransom? That's not just wrong, that's a threat. A wave of whispers spread again. Some folks leaned in, others looked at Kyle Ransom, who was still smiling, but his grip on the file in his hand had tightened. "You come into this town," Steven said, voice low but firm, "wearing that suit, flashing your deals, throwing around terms like revitalization and progress, but what you're really doing is squeezing families off their land, and now you're trying to do it to us." Ransom stepped forward again, still smiling, though his eyes had gone hard. "You can spin it however you like, but you're standing in the way of growth, and let's not pretend this town can afford to stay frozen in the past." Keanu tilted his head slightly. Progress doesn't require pushing people out. It requires respect. You don't get to rewrite the law because you want more zeros on your investment report. From the back, someone clapped, once. Then stopped. The room teetered on a knife's edge. Deputy Clint Landry, tall and lean in a brown uniform, stood up from his spot along the wall and stepped into the aisle. His badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights, catching everyone's eye. "Let's keep this civil," Landry said, walking forward. "It's a town meeting, not a boxing ring." He looked directly at Keanu and Steven. "And I'd suggest you two be careful who you speak against. Some folks don't appreciate being called liars in public." Steven stepped slightly forward. "We didn't call anyone a liar, we brought the truth." Landry's mouth curled, but he didn't speak. He just turned and walked back to the wall. The council moved to the next item on the agenda. Something about pothole funding. But no one was really listening anymore. The air had thickened with something too heavy for civic budgets. Even the councilman's voice cracked a little as he pushed through the motions. Keanu and Steven returned to their seats. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The eyes that had mocked them when they walked in now looked different. Some were cautious, some ashamed. A few still smirked, but even those faces held less certainty than before. When the meeting adjourned, the room emptied slowly. Small groups clustered in the corners, whispering, throwing glances toward the two men standing quietly by the side exit. A mother nodded at Keanu on her way out, holding her toddler close. An older couple looked down as they passed, unsure of where to stand. Steven caught the gaze of Kyle Ransom near the front. The developer was still talking to a few of his supporters, laughing too loudly, gesturing with his hands like none of it had shaken him. But when his eyes met Steven's, the smile flickered. Outside, the night was cooling. A soft wind blew through the parking lot, kicking up leaves. Porch lights blinked on down the road. The sound of gravel crunching under tires echoed as people pulled out and drove home. Keanu stopped beside their truck and glanced at the town hall behind them. "That wasn't a meeting," he said. "It was a warning." Steven nodded. "They're not used to being challenged, especially not by two guys they think should be selling autographs instead of feed." "They picked the wrong road," Keanu said quietly. "And the wrong men." They climbed into the truck. The cab smelled of pine and motor oil. Keanu started the engine, let it idle for a moment, then pulled onto the road, heading home. Neither spoke on the drive back, but their silence said everything. The lines had been drawn, and somewhere between the meeting's first smirk and Landry's last glance, something had shifted. The fight had started. They just hadn't seen the first blow yet. In the distance, the headlights caught the glint of road signs. County Road 14. Home. The fields on either side swayed gently in the wind, but now they looked different. Not just peaceful stretches of land, but battlegrounds waiting for a storm. As they pulled into the long gravel drive leading up to the farmhouse, Keanu glanced at Steven. "You believe him? About the deeds?" "I believe Kyle Ransom's the kind of man who pays lawyers to invent stories and bullies to carry them out." Keanu nodded once. "Then we better hold the line." The porch light was still on when they arrived. Inside, the house was quiet. But in the hearts of two men who'd lived through more than most would ever understand, The quiet wasn't peace anymore. It was preparation. It happened just after midnight. The farmhouse had gone quiet hours earlier. Keanu had fallen asleep in the armchair near the front window, a book resting face down on his chest. Steven was in the back room, the old radio playing a low blues hum while he cleaned out the last drawer of fencing tools. Then came the crash. Glass exploded across the hardwood floor, jolting Keanu upright. The sound wasn't sharp like a gunshot, but deep and chaotic, the unmistakable shatter of something heavy breaking through something fragile. A cold rush of night air followed, along with the faint echo of tires on gravel retreating into the dark. Steven was already moving. He stepped into the hallway just as Keanu rose from the chair, boots hitting the floor in a single, smooth motion. They didn't panic. We didn't shout. He just moved, silent and quick, like men who'd learned in other lives how to function when things went sideways. Keanu grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen counter and swept it toward the broken window. Jagged glass clung to the frame like teeth. On the floor sat a brick wrapped in white cloth, now stained with dirt and blood from a clean slice on Keanu's hand. Steven bent down, unwrapped the cloth. 4 thick black words scrawled in crude marker stared back at them. Leave or burn. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind blew through the shattered window, stirring the edge of the cloth like a flag. Keanu stepped back and looked out into the yard. Nothing moved. No headlights, no voices. Just the dark stretch of field and the rustle of the trees. Steven held up the cloth again. This isn't some teenager pulling a prank. No, Keanu said. This is targeted. They swept up the glass first. Quiet, methodical. Steven got the broom. Keanu picked up the largest shards by hand. They said nothing while they worked. When the floor was clear, Keanu walked to the old cabinet in the hallway and pulled out a small case wrapped in a towel. Inside was a hard drive, a receiver, and a set of long-forgotten USB cables. Didn't think we'd ever need these again, he said. Steven watched as Keanu knelt beside the desk and connected the receiver to the monitor. With a few key clicks, the screen blinked to life. 4 black and white windows appeared, each marked with a date stamp. One pointed at the driveway, one at the barn, one at the front porch, one overlooking the far tree line. The camera over the porch caught it. A shadowed truck, lights off, slow approach. 3 figures stepped out. One held a brick. Another looked up and scanned the road with a flashlight. The third leaned against the hood, like he was watching time tick down. The man with the brick wound up, launched it straight through the front window, and all 3 sprinted back into the dark. Steven studied the screen. Military boots. Coordinated timing. This wasn't amateur hour. Steven leaned in closer, watching the footage again. They weren't in a hurry till after the throw. That means they expected no resistance. They're testing the waters. Keanu rewound the clip, pausing on the figure who'd hurled the brick. The shadows distorted the features, but the stance, the build, the casual confidence, it said more than a clear face ever could. They've done this before, Keanu said quietly. Somewhere else. Maybe a dozen times. Steven stepped out onto the porch and scanned the yard. The wind had picked up. It whistled through the high grass and rattled the tin pail hanging off the side of the barn. He moved down the steps, flashlight slicing through the dark, until he reached the edge of the gravel drive. He crouched. Tire tracks, deep grooves, fresh and damp from where the wheels had spun before tearing off. But it wasn't just the shape that got his attention. It was how far up they came. Whoever did this didn't park on the road. They pulled into the yard, 20 feet from the house. Too close, too bold. Steven stood and scanned the ground again. Near the tire tracks, faint but visible in the moonlight, were 3 sets of boot prints. All deep, all military pattern. Not hiking boots, not work boots. Coordinated, professional. He returned to the porch, his boots heavy on the steps. "The May came too close," he said. "This wasn't a message. It was a prelude." Keanu glanced up. "You see the treads? Standard military issue. Tactical souls, not off the shelf. These weren't kids and they weren't guessing." Keanu turned back to the screen. "They didn't just want to scare us. They wanted to see how we'd react." Steven looked down at the note again. "Leave or burn." He folded it neatly, placed it on the kitchen table, and set the brick beside it like a paperweight. Neither of them said the word threat. It didn't need to be said. Instead, Keanu stood and walked toward the hallway closet. He opened the bottom drawer, pulled out an old wooden box, and laid it on the table. Inside was a set of laminated papers, emergency contact lists, and a folded blueprint of the farm's perimeter they'd drawn years ago, half joking, half serious. He opened it now with no humor at all. Steven looked down at the yellowed paper, then back up at Keanu. "You think they'll come again?" Keanu stared at the note on the table. "Yes." Steven nodded once. "Then we patch the window. We reset the cameras. And we don't sleep until we're sure who sent them." They moved again without a word, one boarding up the broken glass, the other adjusting the angle on the porch camera. The house grew quiet, but the quiet wasn't peaceful. It was poised. The window was sealed before sunrise, a thick board screwed into place, reinforced from the inside. Not perfect, but strong enough to hold if something heavier came flying next time. Steven brewed coffee while Keanu checked the feeds again, cycling through the timestamps. He noted every motion from midnight to now, cataloging any movement. Nothing else had stirred since the truck vanished down the road. They sat at the table in silence. The same table where they'd once read seed catalogs and joked about buying ducks. Now it held a brick, a note, and a printed still image of 3 masked figures frozen in a moment of trespass. Steven sipped his coffee and stared at the photo. "They weren't from town," he said finally. "No one local walks like that. They didn't hesitate. They knew how much time they had between the throw and the retreat." Keanu leaned back in his chair. "You think Ransom hired them?" Steven didn't answer right away. He looked out the boarded window. "If he did, he's not just a greedy developer. He's a man used to not being told no." Keanu picked up the blueprint and rolled it back into a tube. "Then we need to stop telling him no in silence." They didn't speak the rest of the morning. They worked. Steven walked the fence line twice. He reset the tripwire alarms they'd once installed to deter coyotes, repositioned the mirrors that reflected headlights from the main road, and cut a path through the north hedgerow, an old exit they hadn't used since their second winter on the land. Keanu checked the barn, the workshop, and the attic. He removed the box of old film reels and replaced it with something more important, a drive labeled Backup Footage Farm Cams. He placed it in a sealed jar and buried it beneath the 3rd floorboard in the guest room closet. When Steven returned around midday, dust on his boots and sweat on his brow, Keanu was sitting on the porch again, notebook in hand. "What are you writing?" Steven asked. Keanu looked up. "Timeline, just in case." Steven sat beside him. "You think this gets worse?" Keanu nodded. "This was a test. Next one won't be." The wind picked up again. It had the same bitter edge as the night before, the same electric charge in the air, like the sky was holding something back. Steven rubbed his hand over his face. "We didn't come here to fight." Keanu closed the notebook gently. "No, we came here to heal." He looked out across the pasture, where the horses grazed unaware, where sunlight still painted gold across the fence line. "But we won't be chased off either." Steven nodded once. Then they both sat in silence, the kind of silence men use when they know something's coming. Not fear, not anger, readiness. The sun was barely up when Keanu slid behind the wheel of the old Chevy pickup. The truck had seen better years, but it still ran solid. They were headed to the feed store, just a routine supply run, or at least it should have been. Steven climbed in on the passenger side, coffee thermos in one hand, a folded list in the other. He handed it over as Keanu started the engine. 3 bags of cracked corn, 5 of oat blend, and 1 salt block, Steven said. That's it. Keanu glanced at the note and nodded. Shouldn't take more than an hour. Steven leaned back, eyes scanning the tree line as they pulled onto the dirt road. Let's not stop anywhere else. Just get in, get out. The truck rolled over the familiar terrain, bouncing gently on the uneven gravel. Dew still clung to the grass. A few birds darted across the sky. From the outside, it looked like any other morning, but neither of them felt easy. They weren't talking much, but both were listening. Listening to the road, listening to the engine, listening to their own instincts. Half a mile down the road, Keanu pressed his foot to the brake as they approached a bend, and nothing happened. The pedal dropped straight to the floor. No resistance, no slowing. The truck kept moving, speed creeping higher with the descent. Keanu's hands tightened on the wheel. Brakes are gone. Steven sat up straight, alert but calm. Parking brake. Now. Keanu reached for the emergency lever, but the curve was already closing in too fast. Trees lined the right side. A sharp drop-off loomed to the left. A dry ravine filled with jagged rocks and twisted roots. He pulled the lever hard. The truck screamed, tires locking and skidding sideways. Steven braced his feet against the floorboard, one hand on the dashboard, the other gripping the handle above the door. Dust flew up around them in a thick cloud as the truck pitched and skidded, front end sliding dangerously close to the edge. With a final lurch, the tires caught traction on the gravel berm, and the truck jolted to a halt. Less than 3 feet from the ravine's edge. Silence. The engine ticked. A hawk cried overhead. Keanu's hands stayed locked on the wheel, knuckles white. His heart pounded once, twice, then slowed. He looked over at Steven. You all right? Steven exhaled. Yeah. You? Keanu nodded. Steven opened the door and stepped out slowly, boots crunching gravel. He walked around to the front of the truck, crouched down and looked underneath. Keanu followed, kneeling beside him. Steven ran his fingers along the frame, then stopped. Brake line, clean slice, not torn, not rusted, cut. He looked up at Keanu, jaw tight. This wasn't a malfunction. Keanu stared down at the line, eyes narrowing. No, this was a message. Steven stood and scanned the road in both directions. No tire marks, no footprints, just the quiet sway of grass and a sky too calm for what had nearly happened. Well, for Steven, he did have a lot. Baby had to come during the night, he said, voice low. Had time, knew where to cut. Clean work. Keanu stayed crouched, eyes on the edge of the brake line. The cut was deliberate. A single swipe with a fine-tooth blade. It hadn't frayed, it hadn't leaked. It had been sliced with surgical precision. He rose slowly and looked out over the drop. If he hadn't hit the parking brake when he did, they'd be at the bottom of that ravine, trapped under steel and silence. Maybe dead. Maybe not. Either way, the outcome would have been enough to send a message to the town. Accident, Keanu said out loud. That's what they would have called it. Steven looked over. A tragic one, maybe a paragraph in the local paper, some nod to who we used to be. But it wouldn't change what it really was. They stood there for a moment longer, letting the reality settle in. Columbia? Keanu said. Steven nodded. Same kind of heat. When things get quiet before they snap. Keanu's voice was softer. Kosovo for me, when you could smell the trap before you stepped in it. They turned back toward the truck. Keanu grabbed the toolbox from behind the seat and laid it out on the tailgate. He worked in silence, hands moving with practiced ease. Steven stood beside him, arms crossed, watching the treetops. I'll patch the line enough to limp it home, Keanu said. But we're not making it to the feed store today. Steven nodded. No rush. Feed can wait, lives can't. It took 30 minutes to rig a bypass using the emergency cable and clamp they kept for field repairs. It wouldn't hold long, but it would get them back. Keanu slid behind the wheel again, testing the pedal. It gave some resistance, not much, but enough. Steven climbed back in. They didn't speak as the truck rolled forward, slow and deliberate. No music, no coffee, no morning chatter. Just the steady crunch of gravel beneath the tires as they made their way back toward the house. Halfway there, a car passed them going the opposite direction. A white SUV with tinted windows. No plates visible. No familiar face behind the wheel. Just a silhouette. One hand resting casually on the steering wheel. They didn't wave. They didn't slow down. The SUV passed like a shadow stretching across the road. Seen and gone, but not forgotten. Steven watched it in the side mirror until it vanished over the hill. "You think that was one of them?" he asked. Keanu didn't answer. He just kept driving, but his hands were tighter on the wheel than before, and he didn't blink for a long time. Back at the farmhouse, Keanu parked the truck beneath the awning beside the barn. The sun had climbed higher, but the warmth it gave off didn't touch the cold that now lingered between them. Steven jumped down first and walked straight to the back of the truck. He grabbed the coil of towing chain, looping it over one shoulder. "We tow it into the shop, fix it for real, then we lock everything down." Keanu nodded and helped him unhitch the trailer. They worked in rhythm, quiet, efficient, saying only what needed to be said. By the time the truck was backed into the old workshop, Steven had already jacked up the front end. He lay flat beneath it, inspecting the full line now under daylight. "Same cut, clean, same tool," Steven muttered. Keanu handed him a flashlight. "That means the same person." Steven slid out slowly, brushing dust from his shoulders. "Or the same team." They stood together just outside the workshop door, looking back toward the road. Keanu pulled off his gloves and stared toward the distant tree line. "They're escalating," he said. "First the brick, now this." Steven leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Next time, it's not a warning, it's a kill." Keanu didn't flinch at the word. Instead, he stepped into the barn and returned with a locked metal box they hadn't touched since they moved in. He set it on the bench and opened it slowly. Inside were files. Old case photos, names, a folded set of orders from a past life, a medal with faded ribbons, and at the bottom, a shortwave radio receiver. Outdated, but still functional. Steven glanced at it. "Thought you tossed that." "Never did," Keanu said. "Just didn't think I'd need it again." He turned the dial slowly, listening to the static hum, then stopped on a quiet frequency. "I've still got one or two ears who might be listening." Steven grabbed a rag from the pegboard and wiped grease from his hands. "You're calling in help?" Keanu shook his head. "Not yet. Just letting someone know we might need it." Steven stared out toward the field again. "This used to be a place to grow things. Now it feels like we're building a bunker." Keanu's voice was quiet. "That's what happens when people mistake kindness for weakness." The breeze picked up again, rustling the leaves in the distance. Somewhere, a crow called out. The world looked the same, but it no longer felt that way. They closed up the workshop and walked back toward the house, the gravel crunching softly beneath their boots. When they reached the porch, Steven turned to Keanu. "We're not out of surprises, are we?" Keanu looked back at the barn, the truck, and the long stretch of road beyond. "No," he said, "not even close." Then he opened the front door, stepped inside, and left it unlocked behind him. Not because he forgot, but because he knew what was coming, and he was done hiding. It started with the smell. Keanu was by the south pasture, checking the electric fence relay, when a sharp, unnatural scent hit the back of his throat. He turned toward the barn just as Steven came running from the equipment shed, his voice sharp and urgent. "Smoke." Keanu looked up. A thick black column was curling skyward from behind the barn, ugly against the clear blue sky. Flames hadn't reached the roof yet, but the lower corner glowed orange, flickering fast. Heat shimmered above the dry grass. They didn't speak. They just ran. Boots pounded over dirt, adrenaline crashing through their veins. Keanu reached the barn doors first, gripping the steel handle just as a low boom inside rattled the frame. Heat blasted through the cracks, the smell of burning hay, singed rope, and motor oil hitting like a wave. Steven yanked the second door open, and smoke came pouring out like it had been waiting for them. Inside, chaos. Stalls scattered, feed bags ablaze, equipment melting into the concrete. Then, a scream. High, fragile. A child's scream. Keanu didn't hesitate. He sprinted into the smoke, ducking low, eyes searching through the haze. Steven followed, using his jacket sleeve to cover his mouth, yelling over the roar of flames. "Where is she?" Another scream, clearer this time, from the back corner. Keanu found her huddled against the far stall, hands clutching the wooden gate. Her blonde hair was soaked in sweat, cheeks streaked with soot, eyes wide and panicked. "Emmylou!" Keanu shouted, grabbing the gate. The little girl didn't answer. She just pointed past him, deeper into the flames. Steven's voice bellowed from the side. "The dog! She ran in for the dog!" Keanu looked back, then down. A small beagle, trapped in the corner, barking wildly as the flames closed in. Keanu reached over the gate, scooping Emmylou into his arms, shielding her face. "I've got her!" Steven took off toward the dog, pushing through the burning debris, boots crunching glass and ash. The heat was almost unbearable now, the fire reaching into the rafters. Keanu kicked through the smoke, one arm wrapped around the child, her tiny hands gripping his collar. He ducked low, moved fast, dodging collapsing beams. Sparks rained from above like angry bees. Steven reached the dog just as part of the loft gave way with a deafening crack. He wrapped the animal in his coat and turned back, coughing hard. They burst out into the daylight together, stumbling onto the dirt with lungs burning and skin scorched from the heat. Behind them, the barn groaned once more. Then a final blast of flame shot through the roof, sending embers into the air like fireworks. Neighbors had already begun gathering at the fence line, some shouting, others frozen. Keanu dropped to his knees and set Emmylou down gently in the grass. Her chest heaved, but she was breathing. Emmylou coughed once, then opened her eyes. Keanu's hand was already on her back, steady and gentle. "You're safe now," he said softly. "We've got you." Her lower lip trembled and she pointed behind her. "Muffin, my dog." Steven approached, soot covering his face, hair singed at the edges. He crouched beside them and opened his jacket. Inside, the little beagle wriggled free, tail wagging weakly, ears pinned back. It crawled straight into the girl's arms. Emmylou burst into quiet sobs. Keanu wrapped an arm around both of them. "He never lets go of that dog," Steven murmured. "That barn could have collapsed on both of them." From the road, a pickup truck came roaring in, brakes squealing. Emmylou's parents jumped out, her mother crying, her father pale and wide-eyed. They ran toward the group, nearly falling to their knees when they saw their daughter, alive and whole. Steven stepped back. Keanu rose slowly, nodding as the girl's father swept her up into his arms, repeating her name over and over. The mother looked at Keanu through tear-gilled eyes. "Thank you. Thank you both." Keanu just nodded once, his voice still too hoarse to answer. Then came the wail of a siren. Too late. The sheriff's cruiser pulled in as the volunteer fire truck trailed behind. Sheriff Halloran stepped out, moving slow, his face unreadable behind mirrored sunglasses. Deputy Landry followed close behind. The firemen went straight for the barn, but it was already too far gone. All they could do was douse the outer flames and keep it from spreading to the nearby tool shed. Halloran approached the crowd gathered near the pasture, scanning the faces. Most people avoided his gaze. A few looked toward Keanu and Steven. Others just stared at the ground. "Terrible accident," Halloran said, too loud for the moment. Dry season, all it takes is one spark. Steven wiped sweat from his forehead and turned. You call that an accident? Halloran raised a brow. What else would it be? Keanu spoke before Steven could answer. There were 3 gas cans in that barn this morning. 2 are missing. Halloran shrugged. Could have tipped over. Static sparks. Spontaneous combustion? Steven said, voice low. You really want to hang your badge on that? Halloran's mouth twitched. I'd watch that tone. Steven took a step forward, but Keanu touched his arm lightly. Don't, Keanu said under his breath. Not here. Deputy Landry spoke up then, adjusting his belt. Lucky no one was hurt, he said, glancing around the crowd. Could have been worse. Keanu stared at him. It almost was. The crowd had grown quiet, whispers carried from one end of the fence line to the other. Some folks folded their arms. Some looked away. But a few nodded, slowly, subtly. Something in their eyes had changed. They hadn't just seen a barn fire. They'd seen 2 men run into flames and come out carrying a child. The firefighters moved through the smoking ruin with practiced efficiency, axes in hand, hoses trained on the rafters. But there was no saving it. The barn was gone. Only the stone foundation remained, glowing red under the charred wood and ash. Keanu stood near the well pump, staring into the haze. His shirt was soaked through, streaked with soot and sweat. Steven leaned against a fence post, arms crossed, watching Sheriff Halloran with quiet scrutiny. Emmylou's family had taken her home, still thanking them through tears, but their voices had faded into the distance now. What remained was silence, thick, uncomfortable silence. Halloran adjusted his glasses and turned toward Keanu. We'll have someone come out, write a report, check for fire hazards, standard stuff. Keanu didn't answer. He didn't even look at him. Steven did. You think this was random? He asked. The sheriff shrugged again. Could have been lightning last night. Could have been faulty wiring. Could have been a dozen things. We won't know till the report comes back. No storm, Keanu said. And we haven't had power in that barn for 2 years. Landry stepped forward, eyes narrowing. Are you accusing someone of arson? Steven's voice dropped. We're saying someone's already crossed a line. Halloran tilted his head. You got proof of that? Keanu turned toward him, finally meeting his eyes. Not yet. The sheriff nodded slowly, then gave a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Well then, until you do, it's just smoke and stories. He turned to leave. But Steven wasn't done. You ever ask yourself what kind of man sets fire to a barn while a little girl's inside? He called out. Halloran paused, then looked over his shoulder. You ever ask yourself why a little girl was in there in the first place? Then he walked back to his cruiser. The crowd watched as the door slammed shut and the siren lights flicked once, then went dark. The sheriff and Landry pulled away slowly, disappearing down the gravel road. Keanu and Steven stood alone in the yard, the wreckage of the barn smoldering behind them. Smoke curled into the sky, black against the afternoon light. From the fence line, a few neighbors remained. Some lingered in quiet conversation. A few walked over and offered a nod, a hand on the shoulder, a quiet thank you. Not many words, but enough to show they'd seen the truth. That this wasn't about 2 washed-up actors living on borrowed land. This was about something more. Steven looked over at Keanu. You feel it? Keanu nodded once. They're watching, and they're waiting. Steven's hand dropped to the beagle pup at his feet. Muffin had followed him back, still trembling, but safe. We didn't lose a barn, Steven said. We gained attention. Keanu looked at the scorched earth, the smoke still rising, and now we find out what they'll do with it. He turned toward the house, his voice low. Because the next move's not ours, it's theirs. Dusk settled over the farm like a slow exhale. The embers from the barn still glowed faintly in the distance, casting a warm red light against the blackened beams. A thin line of smoke curled into the evening sky, mixing with the pink streaks left by the setting sun. On the porch, Keanu sat hunched over a wooden crate, his sleeves rolled, face streaked with dirt and dried sweat. In front of him lay a weathered canvas pouch, unzipped and half open, revealing a collection of compact tools that hadn't seen the light of day in years. Old surveillance gear, mostly analog, some digital. A mesh of military leftovers and personal improvisations. He worked with precision, uncoiling cables, testing batteries, checking signal range on a small RF scanner. A few feet away, Steven sat in his usual chair with a whetstone in one hand and an old tactical knife in the other. The blade, once silver, had dulled from years of disuse, but he was bringing it back to life with slow, deliberate strokes. The scraping sound was steady, rhythmic. Sharpen, rinse, repeat. Neither man spoke for a while. The silence wasn't heavy. It was focused. Not the silence of defeat, but of resolve being sharpened, just like that blade. A dog barked far in the distance, then silence again. Steven glanced up at Keanu, his voice quiet. "We waited long enough." Keanu didn't look up. "We didn't start this." Steven nodded, returning to the knife. "But we're ending it." Keanu finished testing a sensor and set it aside, then pulled out a small infrared motion detector. He held it up, turning it in the dying light. The lens was scratched but intact. "This'll catch movement up to 70 feet out," he said. "I'll place it in the north tree line." Steven sheathed the now sharpened blade and stood, stretching his back with a wince. "I'll handle the west edge. That trail ransoms boys cut through the field. They'll use it again." Keanu nodded. "Put the reflector panels up while you're out there. I want to know exactly where the moonlight hits. We need to control the shadows." Steven stepped off the porch, grabbed his vest off the rail and slung it over his shoulder. As he moved, his limp, barely noticeable most days, seemed just a bit heavier tonight. Not from injury, but from weariness. Even so, there was a fire in his gait, a purpose. Keanu watched him disappear down the steps, then turned back to the crate and continued assembling the last camera. His hands didn't shake. His breath was steady. He clipped the camera to a small metal post, adjusted the angle, and tested the feed through a handheld monitor. He reached for the next one, a micro camera barely larger than a thumb. The work was repetitive, quiet, focused. But every click, every connection, every bolt secured was building something. Not a trap, not a defense, a plan. By the time Steven returned from the tree line, night had taken full hold. He stepped onto the porch with a slow exhale, brushing bits of dry grass from his jeans. In his hand, he carried a coiled length of wire and a small, broken drone. Its rotors smashed, casing cracked. He tossed it gently onto the table between them. Keanu raised an eyebrow. "Yours?" Steven shook his head. "Nope. Found it stuck in the pine branches out near the fence." Keanu picked it up and examined the make. Military surplus mod. Civilian exterior. Someone was watching. Steven sat down again, rolling his shoulders. "Not anymore." Keanu set the drone aside. "They're testing us, seeing how close they can get without setting off alarms." Steven reached for a towel and wiped his hands. "Well, now we have alarms." The quiet stretched again, this time heavier. The glow from the porch light cast long shadows across the yard. Somewhere out beyond the corn rows, an owl called out. A slow wind stirred the trees. Keanu leaned back and looked toward the barn's remains, barely visible in the dark. "I used to think we could stay invisible here," he said quietly. "Live off the map, fade out, grow things, breathe." Steven followed his gaze. "We did, for a while." Keanu nodded. "But rot doesn't care how quiet you live. It finds its way in." Steven ran a hand down his face. "You think the sheriff knows how far Ransom's pushing this?" "I think he knows," Keanu said. "I just don't think he cares." A pause. Then Keanu reached into the crate again, and pulled out a folded topographical map of the land. He spread it on the porch table, using 2 mason jars to pin the corners. Steven leaned in. Red ink marked their farm's perimeter. Blue indicated natural trails. Black X's showed sensor points. Camera range, high ground, drainage paths. Steven pointed to the south bend. If they come from town, this is the likeliest route. Keanu tapped another spot with his pen. But if they're watching, they'll come from here, through the abandoned Miller property. No lights, no patrols. Steven frowned. You want to wait for them? No, Keanu said. I want to know them. Every movement, every weak spot. He folded the map slowly, precisely. We don't jump, he added. We watch. We listen. Then we act. Steven leaned back again, the knife resting in his lap. You're not who you were in Colombia, he said. Keanu gave a faint smile. Neither are you. They both chuckled softly, the kind of laugh that didn't reach the surface but rumbled deep in the chest. Then silence again. But this time it was shared. Not empty. Not lonely. Just then, they were no longer waiting. They were preparing. Later that night, they moved through the fields like shadows. Keanu, dressed in black from collar to boots, placed thermal markers at key junctions, just outside the motion sensor ranges. He worked quickly, eyes scanning for signs of tampering, footsteps or trails that didn't belong. The air was cooler now, the sky filled with stars, but the tension made every sound sharper, every breath deliberate. Steven worked the eastern edge of the land, near the old irrigation ditch. He crouched low, scanning for unusual impressions. He found one. A boot print, deep, recent, not theirs. He stood up and looked toward the ridge, then he stepped into the tall grass, disappearing again. Back at the farmhouse, the cameras were synced. A small laptop displayed a 6-grid feed, each frame flickering in grayscale. Nothing moved yet, just wind in the trees and the hum of night creatures. Keanu entered the house briefly, retrieved a small sealed container from the back closet. Inside were mementos he hadn't touched in years. Patches from his old unit, a worn photo of a man long gone, and a medallion he once swore he'd never wear again. He clipped it to his belt silently. Out front, Steven was already back on the porch, pacing slowly. His fingers rolled the edge of a leather wristband he wore, frayed from age. He stared out at the darkness, like it might speak to him. Keanu joined him. Neither man said a word for a long time. Then Steven asked, "You think anyone else out here knows who we are?" Keanu didn't blink. "No." Steven nodded. "Good." A long pause. Then Keanu added, "But they're about to." Steven smirked, not out of pride, but out of inevitability. The fire had changed things. Emilu's cry, her little arms wrapped around that dog. Those moments weren't abstract anymore. They were the line. And someone had crossed it. "We send a message?" Steven asked. "Not loud," Keanu replied. "Not yet, just clear." Steven stepped off the porch again, this time with a coil of wire in one hand and a shovel in the other. Keanu followed, a canvas bag over his shoulder. They moved in silence, digging, wiring, setting. Not booby traps, not weapons, just information traps. Early warnings. Places that would speak before footsteps got too close. It wasn't paranoia, it was insurance. The moon rose higher, painting silver streaks across the crops. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote yelped, but it was far away. Steven finished placing a ground sensor and wiped the sweat from his brow. Keanu adjusted the final camera angle before stepping back, arms crossed, surveying the land. And then he spoke, almost to the air itself. "We didn't come here to fight, but that doesn't mean we forgot how." Steven replied without looking up. "And we sure as hell didn't forget why." The land was quiet, but it was no longer defenseless. The streets of Sycamore Ridge were silent at midnight. Streetlights flickered in lazy intervals. throwing dim halos onto cracked pavement. Most of the town slept behind shuttered windows and humming porch fans. But two shadows moved through the alleys with purpose, calm, measured, invisible. Keanu paused behind a row of trash bins near the diner, scanning the sheriff's office across the street. The brick building was quiet, just one light glowing inside above the reception desk. The security camera above the front door panned methodically from left to right. Steven crouched beside him, unslinging a black satchel. Inside, compact tools glinted under the faint moonlight. "You sure about this?" Keanu asked. Steven looked up. "We don't need full proof. Just enough to blow the hinges off their lie." Keanu gave a short nod and moved. While Steven slipped into the shadows toward the rear service door, Keanu crossed the street and positioned himself near the flagpole, half hidden by an old oak. He pulled out a small radio with an earpiece, clicked once. Steven responded with one click back. In less than 30 seconds, the rear door was open. Steven vanished inside. Keanu watched the road, calm but alert. Every passing cricket chirp, every creak from the overhead power lines heightened the stillness. He breathed in slow and deep. Inside, Steven moved like he'd done this before, because he had. The hallway to the main office was lined with filing cabinets, cork boards filled with missing dog posters, and a yellowed map of the county. He passed it all and reached the inner office door. Sheriff Halloran's lair. Locked, of course, but the lock gave after a few practiced movements of his fingers. A faint click, and the door eased open. The room was modest, but organized with careful paranoia. Certificates on the wall, a hunting rifle in a glass case, desk spotless. Steven didn't waste time. He dropped into the sheriff's leather chair, popped open the bottom drawer and pulled out a burner laptop. Not the office desktop. Too obvious. This one was newer, personal, hidden. The kind of device used for what didn't belong on official records. He plugged in a flash decryptor. Outside, Keanu's voice crackled softly in his ear. "Truck just passed. No stop. Keep moving." Inside, folders began to open. Steven scanned quickly. The folders were labeled in shorthand. CR 14A. Morris finalized. SHH KR/SS. He clicked the last one. Photos popped up. Grainy surveillance shots of Keanu and Steven at their property. Dates, times, notes in shorthand. Land, pressure strategy. Escalate fire threat. Confirm bribe channel. Steven's jaw clenched. He opened another file, Halloran ransom ledger. It was all there. Payout dates, deposits, forced evictions, names crossed out, land parcels reassigned to dummy corporations. One name caught his eye. The Hendersons, the family who vanished overnight. Their home was listed under foreclosure, not flight. There were receipts, signatures, all under the sheriff's name. Steven's fingers danced faster now, copying everything to the flash drive. He could feel time closing in. Then something else. Footsteps. He looked up at the security monitor in the corner. A car had just pulled up. A deputy was stepping out. Keanu's voice crackled again. Sharp this time. "Landry. Early. You've got less than 90 seconds. Steven yanked the drive free, wiped the last access logs, and closed the laptop. Steven moved fast, ghosting out of the sheriff's office as if he were never there. He slipped back down the hallway, careful not to disturb a single piece of paper or knock into a creaking floorboard. The security light in the main room cast long shadows, enough to hide him, but not enough to linger. At the rear exit, he paused. Through a sliver in the blinds, he saw Deputy Landry's cruiser pulling into the lot. Too close, too fast. Keanu's voice was calm in his earpiece. "I've got him talking. You've got maybe 2 minutes. South Alley." Steven exhaled and slipped out the back door, hugging the shadows between the sheriff's office and the adjacent hardware store. He moved like he'd done it 1,000 times. Because he had. Out front, Keanu leaned against the metal pole of the town bulletin board, arms folded, head slightly down like a man lost in thought. Deputy Landry stepped out of the car, stretching and adjusting his belt. "Evening," Landry said. Keanu looked up and smiled faintly. "You always work this late?" Landry gave a dry chuckle. "You know how it is. Calls come in, paperwork stacks up. Can't sleep much anyway." Keanu nodded slowly. "Paperwork can bury a man." Landry narrowed his eyes. "You waiting on someone?" Keanu gestured toward the diner. "Just clearing my head. Thought about a coffee." The deputy didn't look convinced, but he shrugged. "Well, be careful. Never know who's still out this time of night." "True enough," Keanu said. Behind them, Steven turned the corner just in time to slip into the alley between the auto shop and the butcher's. He crouched beside a dumpster, waited. He could hear the muffled voices just a block away. Keanu was still buying time. Then, 3 short clicks on the radio. "All clear." Steven moved again, faster now. He cut behind the post office and made it back to their old truck parked in the alley. The truck had no logos, no plates. It looked like junk, but it ran like a ghost. Steven slid into the passenger seat, just as Keanu rounded the far corner, nodding once before climbing in. No words, just silence. They pulled away, headlights off, swallowed by the rural dark. Back at the farm, they parked behind the shed. Steven handed Keanu the flash drive, and Keanu inserted it into an offline laptop they kept for one reason only: evidence. Images filled the screen. The scope of the corruption became painfully clear. Dozens of families, forced off. Lies told, papers forged, and Ransom smiling in every photo with Halloran beside him. The whole thing stank worse than the runoff ditch behind the feed store. Keanu leaned back in the wooden chair, jaw tight. "We were right." Steven was quiet, eyes locked on the screen. "Worse than I thought. They're not just greedy. They're cleansing the whole county." Keanu nodded. "And now we've got proof." Outside, the wind picked up again. This time, it didn't feel like unease. It felt like preparation. From that moment on, the game changed. They were no longer defending their farm. They were dismantling an empire, and it had just begun. The farmhouse kitchen was dim, lit only by a single oil lamp flickering beside the old laptop. Keanu sat at the table, with Steven beside him, both leaning forward, eyes scanning every line of data retrieved from the sheriff's computer. The air smelled faintly of coffee, dirt, and gun oil. Steven rubbed his temple. "It's not just Halloran. Look at this name. Ron Talbot, State Zoning Commissioner, got a vacation home bought by Ransom Holdings, LLC. The deed transfers buried in the files." Keanu clicked again. "And this, Tricor Energy, Ransom Shell Company. They've been paid out consulting fees to county officials." "Blackmail," Steven muttered. "Or bribery, maybe both." The room was quiet except for the occasional chirp of crickets outside and the hum of the hard drive working. On the far wall, the clock ticked methodically, echoing like a countdown. "This goes higher than we thought," Keanu said. "They're not just clearing land for condos, they're trying to push a pipeline through. This county is step 1. Steven leaned back. "And they think they can steamroll whoever's in the way." Keanu opened a drawer beside him and pulled out a slip of paper with a phone number written in fading ink. He picked up the old rotary phone on the wall and dialed. It rang twice before a groggy voice answered. "Maria Cha." "Hey Maria, it's Keanu." There was a pause. Then, "You only call when it's serious." "It is." He told her everything in a few short breaths. The land grabs, the sabotage, the evidence. He didn't need to convince her. Maria had spent 20 years chasing corruption, and she trusted Keanu like a brother. "Send me what you've got," she said. "If it's as deep as you say, I'll make sure it sees daylight. But be careful, Keanu. You're not just poking the bear, you're walking into its cave." "I know," he said, "but I'm not alone." After they hung up, Steven was already at the workbench, laying out old gear like sacred relics. A coil of paracord, a motion sensor, nails, fishing line, a stun baton. Every tool had a story. Keanu joined him silently. For the next hour, the two of them moved through the property like chess masters on a board. They wired trip alarms near the edge of the fields, installed silent motion lights behind the barn, set up pressure-sensitive mats near the entrance gate that would trigger a high-frequency noise and trained humans would detect. It wasn't about hurting anyone. It was about buying time, making intruders question their choices. They rigged the chicken coop with a timed flare drop, harmless but startling. Steven even placed decoy cameras made of tin cans and fishing swivels just to keep anyone paranoid guessing. Back in the house, Keanu loaded the files onto a secondary drive and placed it in a hidden compartment beneath the old floorboard, just in case they burned the place. Steven nodded, holding up a taser baton and spinning it once in his fingers. "We don't get medals for this, do we?" Keanu smiled faintly. "Nope, just a clean conscience." Steven poured 2 mugs of black coffee and handed one over. Outside, the wind was still, but it was the kind of stillness that made your skin itch, the kind you only felt before something broke loose. "We ready?" Steven asked. Keanu didn't hesitate. Almost. As midnight approached, the temperature dropped and fog began to roll in low across the field. Keanu and Steven moved from post to post, testing the last of the silent sensors. Neither spoke much, but every glance between them carried the weight of shared understanding. They had both known darker nights than this, and yet this one felt personal. Back in the kitchen, Keanu unfolded a county map, the edges yellowed from years pinned on the wall. He marked key entry points with a red grease pencil. The gravel road to the west, the overgrown back trail where the Hendersons used to ride their ATV, and the dry creek bed that wound behind the barn like a secret path. Steven leaned over the map. "That's where I'd come in if I wanted to avoid cameras." Keanu marked it with a black X. "Then we'll put a noise trip there. Maybe even a net snare." Steven grinned. "Getting creative. They're not coming with lawsuits anymore, they're coming with gasoline and guns." Keanu looked out the window. In the distance, the old windmill turned slowly, groaning like a sentinel, warning of what lay ahead. They moved to the barn next, now repaired after the fire. Emmylou's crayon drawing still hung on one wall, curling at the edges. Steven paused beside them, staring at one that showed him holding a leash attached to a smiling, spotted dog. "Said this the day after," he said softly. "Said I looked like a cowboy." "You were," Keanu replied, "just not the kind on TV." Steven touched the drawing gently, then turned to check the emergency supplies. First aid kit, walkie-talkies, battery packs. Everything had been tested and retested. Keanu took a deep breath, then walked outside. He scanned the horizon. Somewhere beyond those fields, someone was planning a final push. Not to scare them, not to intimidate them, but to erase them. He felt it in his bones. He turned to Steven. "Tomorrow Maria goes public. That means tonight, we're the secret. After that, we're the story." Steven nodded. "Then let's make sure it's one worth telling." Back inside, Keanu uploaded the files to a secure cloud, then printed hard copies and sealed them in a metal ammunition box, placing it beside the hearth. They sat again on the porch, drinking the last of their coffee. Somewhere in the woods, a coyote howled. Steven smirked. "They don't know what kind of wolves they're waking." Keanu didn't respond. His hand rested calmly on the railing, eyes fixed on the dark. The traps were set. The land was prepared. The truth was armed. And morning was coming fast. The farmhouse felt unnaturally quiet that night, as if even the wind had stopped to listen. Inside, Keanu and Steven worked with quiet precision. There was no panic in their movements, only a sense of seasoned urgency. They had been here before. Different place, different war, but the pattern was familiar. On the living room table sat 3 identical flash drives. Each held copies of the damning files they'd retrieved. Documents, audio recordings, surveillance screenshots. Corruption that stretched from their sleepy Georgia town all the way to state procurement boards and a shadowy holding company in Atlanta. Every piece had been sorted and time-stamped. Keanu plugged the first drive into his laptop and uploaded it to a secure off-site server linked to a legal nonprofit in Washington. The second copy was mailed with a handwritten letter to Maria Chan, using an alias and a return address 2 states over. The third drive, Steven's responsibility, was slid into a vacuum-sealed pouch, wrapped in an oil rag and placed inside a rusted biscuit tin. Without a word, he walked out onto the porch, pried up a loose floorboard, and buried it beneath a box of spare nails and an old tin of chewing tobacco. He hammered the board back into place and stood up slowly, dusting his palms on his jeans. "Done," he said simply. Keanu nodded. "Then it's time." They moved outside into the stillness of their land. The moonlight spread wide over the fields, casting pale shadows across the barn, the fence line, and the gravel road that led to the main gate. A few floodlights on motion sensors lit key choke points, but much of what they had planned didn't rely on sight. Steven walked the north fence with a spool of razor-thin monofilament. Not lethal, just high enough to trip. Farther out, he placed a few handmade devices, modified bear traps designed not to break bone, but to alert. As he moved, he tucked trail cams into natural cover, their night vision eyes blinking silently in readiness. Keanu worked on the south end, where the old dry creek bed curved behind the barn. There, he set up low prophylaxis programmed clay pots filled with biodegradable dye and fish hooks, nasty, disorienting tools for marking intruders without serious harm. Above them, 2 ancient drones, leftovers from a documentary he'd once funded, hovered silently, programmed to ping their location every 30 seconds. In the barn, Steven positioned a speaker near the hayloft, loaded with pre-recorded dog barks and static chatter. Distraction was part of the plan. Confuse, split, disorient. As they moved through their preparation, time felt elastic. Hours passed, but neither man checked a watch. The rhythm of their tasks carried them forward: wire, nail, battery, sensor, test. By 3:10 a.m., they met again on the porch. Steven poured 2 cups of lukewarm coffee, handed one to Keanu, and leaned against the post. "Think we missed anything?" Keanu looked out into the darkness. He considered every path, every sound, every line of defense now buried in the soil they had come to love. "No," he said. "They'll come. They always come before dawn." Steven didn't argue. Instead, he turned back toward the house and picked up a small leather pouch from the side table. He opened it slowly, revealing 2 black rings, identical in design. Both had been forged long ago from a piece of melted-down combat steel, a private promise between 2 men who had seen too much. Steven handed one to Keanu. Keanu slid it on without hesitation. Then they sat in silence, waiting. The first sign wasn't sound. It was a flicker, just barely visible on the farthest trail cam's feed. A shape crossing behind the tree line near the east pasture. Then another. Keanu tapped the screen quietly. Early, Steven didn't flinch. Cowards usually are. The old farmhouse creaked gently as the 2 men moved back inside. Lights off, windows slightly cracked for listening. Steven secured the rear door while Keanu opened the gun safe. Not for weapons, but for tools less lethal. Smoke pellets, strobe flashlights, compressed air cans disguised as fence sprayers. Down the hall, a red indicator blinked on the surveillance hub. Ocean, north fence, then west. Multiple angles, classic squeeze, Keanu said under his breath. Steven watched the small screen as a figure tripped the monofilament wire and dropped hard into the mud. Seconds later, a burst of motion from the dry creek bed, the dye pot ignited. The air filled with thick blue haze as a man stumbled back, screaming. Red hook barbs clinging to his jeans. Keanu switched screens. "Camera 2's out." Steven nodded. "Time for phase 2. He flipped the switch on the old ham radio receiver. A sharp burst of dog barking echoed from the barn's loft speakers. 2 attackers froze, then split in opposite directions. One dove behind a barrel, another sprinted toward the feed shed, only to be hit by a stun wire rigged to a tractor battery. He collapsed instantly, groaning. Keanu scanned the live feeds again. "We've got 5 down, maybe 3 still moving." Then came the flash of a spotlight, a real one, cutting through the trees like a blade. A truck rumbled down the dirt road, tires spitting gravel, moving too fast. "That's not a contractor van," Steven muttered. The sheriff's department logo was visible on the side. Keanu stepped outside, hands raised casually. The cruiser slammed to a stop at the gate, lights still spinning. Deputy Landry stepped out, one hand on his holster. "Got reports of a disturbance," he said flatly. Keanu smiled. "Funny. So did we. Want to take a walk?" Landry hesitated. Something in Keanu's eyes made him blink. Steven joined them with a tablet in hand. "Before you say anything else, you might want to see what your boss signed off on," Steven said. He played a clip, Sheriff Halloran's voice discussing forced property seizures, followed by a payment ledger listing Ransom's company. Landry stared, then cursed. Behind them, more figures moved in the darkness, wounded, confused, marked with blue dye. "Guess we'll be needing zip ties," Landry muttered. Keanu didn't smile. He simply turned to the horizon. Dawn was coming. The wind shifted at midnight, carrying more than just the smell of dew and tilled earth. It carried the scent of gasoline and boots. Keanu sat motionless in the dark of the kitchen, back straight, eyes alert. The old wind-up clock on the wall ticked a slow rhythm. Then, the faint crunch of gravel outside. "They're here," Steven said from the hallway, already pulling on his gloves. 3 trucks rumbled up the long drive, their headlights off. Shadows moved quickly, fanning out from the beds. Bats glinted in the moonlight. Some carried shotguns. Others had gas cans. The gang wore masks, cheap ones, but it wasn't to hide their identity. It was to make a statement. They thought they could intimidate. They thought they were the predators. The first tripwire snapped, releasing a clatter of tin cans and the high-pitched whistle of a handmade alarm Keanu had rigged 2 nights before. From hidden speakers buried in the bushes, loud footsteps and shouting voices began to echo across the property, designed to make it sound like 10 more men were inside the house. The attackers froze. Then one barked, "It's fake! Move!" 2 of them ran toward the barn with a gas can, intending to burn it down again. As they passed the old wheelbarrow, a smoke bomb ignited at their feet, swallowing them in a cloud of gray. They dropped the can and choked, stumbling backward, right into Steven, who stepped from behind the haystack with a shovel and knocked the first man out cold with a single strike to the back. The second lunged at him with a crowbar, but Steven grabbed his wrist mid-swing, twisted, and dropped him to the ground like he weighed nothing, then zip-tied his hands behind his back. Farther up, near the porch, Keanu crept along the side of the house in complete silence. One of the men had split from the group and now crouched by the kitchen window, trying to climb in. Keanu moved quickly, wrapping his arm around the man's neck in a clean, tight chokehold. The man struggled only for a moment before going limp. Keanu lowered him gently to the ground and slid him out of view. He whispered into his earpiece, "3 down." Steven's voice came back. "One's got a Molotov, back fence." Keanu didn't hesitate. He sprinted across the side yard, staying low, weaving between wooden posts and wild sage. The moonlight cut across the field in silver streaks. He moved like a shadow, like he had in cities far more dangerous than this. Only this time, It wasn't a mission. It was home. The man with the Molotov was raising his arm to throw, but just before he could, a sharp crack echoed through the field. It wasn't gunfire. It was the whip of Steven's old lasso, catching the man's wrist mid-throw. The bottle slipped and shattered harmlessly on the grass. Keanu tackled him from behind before he could recover. "4 down," Keanu said, breathing hard. But from the truck, Kyle Ransom watched with growing fury. His hand gripped a handgun tightly as he barked into a walkie-talkie. "Burn it down, now." The order sent a surge of adrenaline through the gang. 3 more figures rushed forward, this time from the rear fence line, dragging chains and sledgehammers. One broke off toward the tool shed. The other 2 sprinted for the porch. Inside the farmhouse, Steven checked the rear monitor. Motion sensors flared red. He grabbed a fire extinguisher and tossed it to Keanu. "South side, tool shed," Steven said. "If they torch it, the whole field's gone." Keanu took off through the kitchen door without a word. Meanwhile, Steven slipped into the shadows again, ducking low as one of the men smashed a side window and tried to climb in. But the window frame had been rigged with a paint trap. A split second after the intruder's hand entered, a spring-loaded dye pack exploded, blinding him with blue. He screamed, stumbled, and fell backward onto the porch, flailing. Steven met him halfway and knocked him out with a precise knee to the gut. Another man saw it happen and opened fire, shattering the porch railings. Steven dove behind a stone planter as the bullets tore through wood. From the rear of the property, Keanu spotted the 2 arsonists heading for the shed. One carried a gas can, the other lit a flare. Keanu didn't run. He picked up a stone and tossed it far to the left. It clattered in the bushes. The one with the flare turned toward the sound. Keanu closed the gap in 4 strides and tackled him to the ground. The flare tumbled, hissing out in the dirt. The second man swung the gas can like a weapon, but Keanu blocked it with his forearm, grabbed the man's jacket, and delivered a clean strike to the side of his neck. They both went down. Keanu stayed low, breathing hard, ears tuned to every movement. Back near the house, Steven rolled out from his hiding spot and fired a beanbag round from the modified shotgun he kept under the porch bench. The man with the gun dropped instantly, moaning as the round knocked the wind out of him. Inside the gang's lead truck, Kyle Ransom slammed his fists against the dashboard. "You idiots," he barked. "We outnumber them 10-2. He jumped out, his rage boiling over, and ran toward the field with a small can of gasoline and a lighter in hand. What he didn't know was that the field had been rigged. Every few yards, Keanu and Steven had dug subtle trenches lined with fire-retardant gel and trip-strengthened water bombs. As Kyle struck the lighter and bent down, one foot hit the wire. A splash. The lighter fizzled. Then came a slow, humiliating silence. Kyle stood up, drenched and furious. From behind him, a calm voice cut through the dark. "I wouldn't try that again." Kyle spun around, gun raised. But Keanu had already vanished into the shadows again. The night sky turned orange. Flames roared from the barn again, sending heat waves pulsing through the dark like the breath of a dragon. It wasn't by accident. Keanu had rigged the structure with slow-burn fuel and a controlled ignition, bait to draw every eye and camera toward the blaze. The perfect distraction, and the perfect evidence. Hidden among the tall grasses were 6 motion-sensitive trail cameras. Some were aimed toward the burning barn, but others were carefully positioned on the ridgeline road where the deputies had parked their cruisers. Steven crouched low behind a tractor wheel as he watched the shadows shift. Boots crunched, muffled voices barked orders. Then came the sharp staccato of gunfire. Rounds thudded into the farmhouse's sideboards, deliberate, tactical shots. Not warning fire, not misfire. Someone had ordered it, and now they were caught on camera. Inside the house, Keanu watched from a small wall-mounted monitor. Each camera was transmitting to a secure local server. He whispered under his breath, "We got them." Outside, Steven moved like a shadow himself. Two armed men broke away from the group to flank the house. Steven reached them before they knew what hit them. The first swung a rifle clumsily, but Steven grabbed the barrel, twisted, and dropped him with a kick to the thigh. The second hesitated too long. A shovel, one of the same tools they'd used to build their vegetable beds, clanged against his helmet, and he went limp in the grass. Keanu darted out from the back door just as the wind shifted, drawing the smoke over the attackers. His movements were precise, silent, methodical. A man charged him with a bat. Keanu sidestepped, grabbed his wrist, and used his momentum to flip him headfirst into the dirt. Another lunged with a taser. Keanu knocked it aside with a forearm and pinned the man with a knee, whispering, "Stay down." The sky above lit up again, not just with fire, but with blue and red lights, like a second sunrise. The sound of tires on gravel came like thunder across the fields. Steven froze. Keanu stood upright, breathing hard. From the far side of the property, black SUVs and matte gray trucks raced in, headlights blinding. Men in dark suits leapt out, with weapons drawn, moving in formation. Keanu stepped forward, hands raised. "FBI," one of the agents called. "Everyone drop your weapons and lie face down, now." But Kyle Ransom wasn't done. He'd seen the lights too. Instead of surrendering, he pushed through the smoke, eyes red and wild, and found Keanu standing alone. He pulled the gun from his waistband and aimed it straight at Keanu's chest. Time froze. The flashing lights from the FBI trucks painted Kyle Ransom's face in alternating streaks of red and blue, but his eyes didn't move, locked on Keanu, not on the agents, not on Steven, who was already circling behind him like a panther. Just Keanu. The man who had stood in his way from the start. "You think you're some kind of hero?" Ransom spat. "You're just an actor playing soldier." Keanu didn't blink. "Then why are your hands shaking?" Ransom's finger twitched on the trigger. Steven didn't wait for the shot. From 20 feet away, his arm snapped forward. The baton, sleek, military grade, spun through the air with a silent arc of precision. It struck Ransom's wrist with a dull crack. The gun fired, but the bullet buried itself harmlessly in the soil. Ransom howled in pain and dropped the weapon. Keanu stepped forward and kicked it out of reach. The FBI agents surged in, shouting commands, surrounding Ransom and the other attackers like a collapsing wall. Dozens of them hit the ground, zip-tied and disarmed in seconds. Deputy Landry tried to run but tripped over a tripwire and tumbled faceless into a ditch. 2 agents were on him before he could move again. From the edge of the property, a figure stepped forward holding a press badge. Maria Chan. She carried a flash drive in her gloved hand, the same one Steven had duplicated hours earlier. A recording played through a small speaker. Sheriff Halloran's voice, recorded just nights ago. "They're just old ghosts clinging to land that ain't theirs. Give 'em a scare, burn their barn if you have to." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some townspeople had gathered in the distance, lured by the sirens and smoke. Now they heard the truth, raw and undeniable. Steven walked up beside Keanu. His shirt was torn, smoke stained his arms, but his eyes were clear. "Damn it, thought we'd go quietly," he said. Keanu nodded. "They forgot where we came from." Agent Ramirez, the lead FBI officer on site, approached them. He was calm, sharp-eyed, and respectful. "We've been tracking Ransom and Halloran for months," Ramirez said. "Couldn't get hard evidence until now. You boys just lit up the whole map." Keanu glanced at the smoldering barn. "Literally." Ramirez smiled faintly. "There'll be arrests statewide after this. You have no idea how far this goes, but tonight, this property is safe." The moment held. Fire crackled in the distance. The once threatening barn, now reduced to charred bones, still smoldered. But the light it cast wasn't just ruin, it was revelation. A farm once considered worthless had become the battleground for something bigger than crops and cattle. Justice had found its foothold here. Emmy Lou and her parents stood at the edge of the field. The little girl clutched her dog and waved. Her mother whispered something to her, and Emmy yelled, "Thank you." Steven's lip twitched. Not exactly the retirement I pictured. Keanu exhaled slowly. But the right one. The agents began leading the cuffed men away. Ransom, bruised and shaking, locked eyes with Keanu one last time. There was no more fire in them. Only fear. Keanu said nothing. He didn't need to. As the sun began to rise on the horizon, light crept across the fields. It touched broken earth, blackened walls, and blood-streaked shirts. But it also lit up something else. The truth. The town square buzzed with nervous curiosity as morning sunlight spilled over the rooftops of storefronts and rusting lampposts. By 8 a.m., a makeshift press podium had been assembled outside City Hall. Microphones lined the front rail, cables snaked across the cracked pavement. A small crowd gathered, quiet and watchful. Then Maria Chan stepped up to the podium, calm and poised despite the tension still crackling from the night before. The bruises on her arms were faint but visible. She'd been there when the barn exploded, when the bullets flew, and when the truth began to break open. Now she was here to finish what had been started. Standing beside her were Keanu Reeves and Steven Seagal, both in clean shirts but visibly weathered. Their calm expressions didn't waver as the cameras began to roll. Maria cleared her throat and looked directly into the main lens. "This is Maria Chan, live from Bailey County, Texas. What I'm about to share will likely change the lives of hundreds, and hopefully set a precedent for thousands more." She turned to a tablet and tapped it once. Behind her, a mobile screen lit up with a grainy night vision video. Men with rifles swarming a peaceful farmhouse, gunfire in the distance, the barn engulfed in flames. Then a pause. A separate audio track began. Sheriff Halloran's recorded voice, admitting to the burnings, the bribery, and the framing of local landowners. The crowd went silent. Maria continued. These images and recordings, gathered over the past week by civilians and whistleblowers, confirmed the following. Kyle Ransom, Sheriff Halloran, and several deputies engaged in a coordinated effort to illegally seize rural land for profit. The landowners were labeled squatters. Their deeds were buried in fraudulent filings, and those who resisted were threatened, silenced, or targeted. She let the words settle like ash over the crowd. The FBI has reviewed the evidence. As of this morning, arrest warrants have been issued. Raids are currently underway. As if on cue, several phones buzzed in the crowd. One man held his up, eyes wide. "They just took Halloran," he said, "right in front of his ranch." Cheers broke out. A woman holding her baby pressed forward, trembling. We were told our property line was wrong, that we owed back taxes. They took our goats. My husband, he thought it was just our mistake." Steven nodded solemnly. "It wasn't your mistake," Maria continued with calm precision. "The scheme was extensive. It reached into the state's land commission. There were shell companies, false mineral rights, hush payments. But it ends now." A second screen lit up, this time showing scanned copies of the false deeds side by side with the originals Steven and Keanu had unearthed from town archives. The digital forensic trail was undeniable. Timestamps, handwriting inconsistencies. Even Halloran's initials were forged on some. In the back of the crowd, someone clapped, then another. Then a wave of applause rippled forward, not the thunder of celebration, but the rhythm of relief. People who had whispered in grocery stores and locked their doors at sundown were now standing tall in the morning light. The tide had turned. By mid-morning, Bailey County wasn't just a small town with a scandal, it was a national headline. News vans arrived from Houston and Austin, followed by a helicopter from Dallas. Journalists descended on the square with cameras and boom mics, asking townspeople what they knew. For the first time in years, the townspeople weren't afraid to speak. An elderly man named Russell, whose property had been threatened last winter, raised his voice to the cameras. "I knew something was off when Halloran's men came with no notice, no paperwork, just force. They told me to move off my land or face arrest. 40 years I've been on that farm. They don't scare me now." The ripple effect of justice was accelerating. Keanu and Steven stood at the back of the square, watching quietly as Maria continued her broadcast. She shifted the focus now, showing a clear financial trail. Land bought for pennies on the dollar, funneled through LLCs connected to Kyle Ransom's cousin and a mysterious investment group based in Nevada. That group, Maria explained, had links to defense contracts and infrastructure development. It wasn't just about farms, it was about power and money. The footage cut to body cam clips from last night. Deputies firing at the farmhouse, their badges clearly visible. In the background, Steven's voice could be heard yelling, "No one has to get hurt," as they tried to push back the attackers non-lethally. Then came the clip that silenced even the most skeptical viewers. Ransom screaming, "Burn it down," as he lit a Molotov cocktail just before FBI sirens lit up the field. The video ended. Maria looked up. This wasn't just corruption. It was war on American families, by those sworn to protect them. And two men, quiet, humble men, chose not to run. They chose to stand. She turned toward Keanu and Steven. The cameras followed. The crowd turned too. A few children came forward first. Emmy Lou, the girl whose dog had been saved during the barn fire, held up a handmade sign, "Thank you, heroes." Behind her, her father approached Steven with tears in his eyes. "I never even said thank you. I was too scared of them, but you ran into that fire like she was your own. We owe you more than thanks." Steven nodded softly, his eyes misty. Keanu stepped up beside him. "We didn't do it for thanks. We did it because silence isn't peace, and fear doesn't protect the land. People do." A wave of emotion surged through the crowd. People stepped forward with their own stories. Harassment at land offices, threats from deputies, mysterious fires, missing paperwork. It all began to form a picture far worse than anyone had wanted to admit, but now they weren't alone. Dozens of townspeople began pulling old documents from folders and envelopes. Someone brought a ledger from the general store, dated 3 years back, noting suspicious bulk purchases of flammable materials. Another woman, once too afraid to speak, offered voicemail recordings from a deputy threatening to reconsider her loyalty. The FBI agents still stationed around the square began collecting it all. Maria's broadcast was now trending on social media under the hashtag #FarmJustice. I saw little reason to fear trouble at the very least. Local news anchors paused their regular segments to cut live to Bailey County. Politicians from the state legislature began issuing statements, some promising investigations, others scrambling to distance themselves from Halloran and Ransom. But amid the whirlwind, Keanu and Steven didn't step into the spotlight. Instead, they stood quietly near a bench outside the diner, watching the people reclaim their voices. Steven looked over at Keanu. "That's more dangerous than any weapon." "What is?" Keanu asked. Steven nodded toward the square. "Truth. Once it gets out, no one can put it back in the bottle." Keanu gave a small, tired smile, then let it pour. The sun rose over Bailey County with a warmth that hadn't been felt in years. Not just in temperature, but in the way it touched everything differently now. Softer, more open, as if the land itself had exhaled. At the farmhouse, the smell of freshly cut lumber filled the air. Hammering echoed across the fields, not in desperation, but in hope. Men from town had shown up at first light. Some brought tools, others brought paint. Even the sheriff's former deputy, now a free man after whistleblowing on the corrupt department, showed up with a truckload of supplies and no words, just a nod. The barn had burned to the ground in the assault. What stood now in its place was the rising skeleton of a new one, beams cut clean, raised high with the help of both old hands and young ones. Steven worked alongside them, sleeves rolled up, a pencil tucked behind his ear. He hadn't said much all morning, but he didn't need to. Every nail he drove was a statement. They weren't leaving, and they weren't hiding. Keanu, meanwhile, was near the chicken coop, talking with a group of children who had wandered over from the school bus stop. Emmy Lou was there too, her little hand clutching his as she told him all about her new puppy, the one her family had finally let her keep after the fire. The dog had survived thanks to Steven's quick thinking, and Emmy had named it Hero. "Is he eating okay?" Keanu asked. "Like a pig," she giggled. "Mama says he's gonna burst." Her father stepped forward, face red with both sun and humility. "We brought a pie," he said, holding out a tin covered in a cloth. "Apple, from our orchard." Keanu nodded, taking it with both hands. "Thank you." "No," the man said, glancing toward the half-built barn. "Thank you for giving us back our voices." Behind them, cars passed by the road more frequently now, honking once in appreciation, kids waving from open windows. It hadn't been that long ago that most people in town either avoided eye contact or stared too long, uncertain of who or what Keanu and Steven really were. Now it was different. They weren't rumors anymore. They were real, flesh and bone, fire-tested, respected. And the town had changed with them. At the diner that afternoon, Keanu and Steven sat in a corner booth with a quiet view of the square. The waitress, a young woman named Tessa, who once refused to serve them during those early, tense weeks, brought over 2 plates of roast beef and mashed potatoes. "On the house." She placed them down and smiled. "Y'all need anything else, you just wave. It's the least I can do." Steven raised an eyebrow, amused. "Kindness is contagious, huh?" Keanu gave a tired but genuine smile. "Seems like it." Across the street, someone was repainting the faded wall of the old post office. It used to read Property of Progress Corp., a leftover from the real estate company behind Ransom's scheme. Now the paintbrush moved with purpose, replacing it with something better. A new mural had begun to take shape. 2 men in silhouette, one holding a shovel, the other holding a girl's hand. Above them, 3 words were already dry. "We remember who." By evening, the last of the volunteers packed up their trucks and headed home. The new barn stood half-finished, but proud, its clean lines stark against the warm orange sky. Keanu stood outside the farmhouse, sipping coffee from a chipped mug, watching the horizon fade. Steven joined him silently, wiping sawdust from his arms with an old towel. For a long moment, neither spoke. There was no need. The crackle of crickets and the soft coo of doves filled the space where words used to be required. Steven broke the silence first. "You ever think we'd be part of something like this again?" Keanu's eyes traced the hills beyond the field, where smoke had once risen and now only mist rolled through the valley. "No, I thought we were done." Steven nodded. "So did I." They looked out together, their gazes landing on the dirt path where Emmy Lou had dropped a crayon earlier. Keanu walked over, picked it up, and placed it on the porch rail like it was something sacred. Not long after, a knock came at the screen door. Maria Chan stood there, still dressed in the same jacket she'd worn during the live broadcast, her camera gear slung across her shoulder and her eyes sparkled with energy. "I brought something," she said, holding out a USB drive. The full segment went viral, 20 million views and counting. FBI's opened a second investigation into the governor's office. Steven whistled low. "Didn't think we'd take down a state racket from a chicken farm." Maria smiled. "Turns out all you needed was a little signal and a lot of grit." Keanu accepted the USB drive, but his focus shifted to something behind her. 2 teens riding their bikes down the lane, stopping shyly when they spotted him. One of them raised a hand. "Hey, Mr. Reeves." Keanu waved back. The boys hesitated, then one of them shouted, "We're not scared anymore." Keanu's face didn't change much, but the corner of his eyes tightened. He nodded once, slow. Neither are we. Later that night, after Maria left and the farmhouse settled into a rare peace, Keanu sat alone at the kitchen table, penning a letter. Steven entered, wiping his hands on a rag, and saw the paper. "What's that?" "A list," Keanu said, not looking up. "Of what?" Keanu finally met his gaze. "People who need help." Steven pulled out a chair and sat across from him. "We really doing this?" "We already started." Steven leaned back, exhaled slowly. Then he gave a tired chuckle. "All right then." The next morning, Emmy Lou's family returned with fresh eggs and canned peaches. A group of older men from the VFW showed up to help with the barn roof. The kids from the school came by in the afternoon with hand-drawn cards, each one showing Keanu and Steven with cartoon muscles and superhero capes. By sunset, the town had spoken, not with parades or speeches, but with shovels, food, laughter, and an unmistakable shift in energy. The land felt whole again. So did the people. And so did Keanu and Steven. They weren't ghosts anymore. They were guardians. The kind who didn't ask for thanks, didn't wait for permission, and didn't run from fire. They just stood up, and the world finally stood with them. The sky was painted with the kind of gold that only came after everything had been torn down and rebuilt. It stretched wide above the farmhouse, soft and generous, like it had been waiting patiently for peace to return. Keanu sat on the front porch, boots crossed at the ankles, a letter unfolded in his hands. His eyes traced the familiar handwriting, line by line, not in haste, but in reverence. Maria's words were crisp, honest, and full of awe. "You two started a fire. Not the kind that destroys, but the kind that wakes people up." The footage of the assault reached every major outlet within 12 hours. Public support is overwhelming. You've become symbols, not vigilantes, not outlaws. Just two men who reminded everyone what quiet bravery looks like. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in the box beside his chair, right next to the weathered chessboard and the half-finished novel he never seemed to get through. Steven stepped out onto the porch, towel slung over his shoulder, chewing thoughtfully on a piece of dried apple. He nodded toward the box. "Another one?" Keanu nodded. "Maria said it's gone national. She's being asked to do a follow-up. Everyone wants the story." Steven rolled his eyes and leaned against the wooden post, looking out at the fields where new seedlings were already starting to break through. "Let them talk," he said after a while. "We've got fences to mend." Keanu chuckled, soft and genuine. "Literally," Steven grinned. "And figuratively." They sat in silence for a few minutes, listening to the distant hum of cicadas and the occasional thump of a goat brushing against the fence. A wind chime made of old shell casings tinkled gently under the eaves. It was the kind of silence that came with no pressure, no tension, just presence. A truck rolled by slowly on the dirt road. One of the neighbors. The driver honked once and raised a hand. Steven raised his back. No fear in their eyes now, no suspicion, just respect. Steven lowered himself into the chair beside Keanu and reached for the thermos between them. He poured 2 mugs of coffee, then handed one over. "So what now?" he asked, taking a sip. Keanu didn't answer right away. He watched a butterfly land on the edge of the porch, its wings torn slightly but still beating strong. Then he said, "We keep living. We plant, we fix, we eat, we keep watch, but we live." Steven nodded slowly, that same contented quiet settling into his bones. "And if they come again?" Keanu didn't flinch. "They won't, but if they do..." He glanced toward the barn, stronger now than ever, reinforced and bright with new lumber. "We'll be ready." Morning came with a hush, not the silence of fear or waiting, but of calm. Dew clung to the fields like the land was exhaling after a long, tense breath. The scars were still visible, burnt patches near the barn, fencing still half-mended, bullet holes in the tractor shed. But life had resumed. Steven was out back, tending to the chicken coop. A few hens pecked around his boots while he replaced a broken slat. He worked with no rush, no need to look over his shoulder. His face was relaxed, in a way it hadn't been in years. Keanu stood near the fence line, hands in his jacket pockets, gazing out toward the hills. Two children from a nearby farm passed on bikes. The younger one waved excitedly. "Hi, Mr. Reeves." Keanu smiled, nodding back. "Morning." The girl turned to her brother. "He's the one that saved Emmy Lou, right?" Their voices faded down the trail, but Keanu's smile lingered, not for the praise, but for the fact that the story had become one told by children now, like folklore, handed down for the right reasons. Inside the house, a stack of unopened mail sat by the door. Offers from networks, requests for interviews, even a handwritten note from a senator asking if Keanu and Steven would consider consulting on community defense programs. They left them unopened. Steven came in, wiping his hands on a towel. The goats knocked the trough over again. Keanu gave him a mock-serious look. "Maybe we should train them in tactical defense next." Steven laughed, that rare kind of deep, chesty laugh that only happened when the weight truly lifted. "They've already got the headbutts down." They walked together to the barn. A group of teenagers from town had helped rebuild it, one board at a time. Every nail, every plank, told a story. There were initials carved into a beam near the back. Emmy Lou had left her mark quietly, along with a little heart. Steven placed a hand on the beam. "Used to be we'd measure impact by how many people we eliminated. Now," Keanu joined him. "Now we measure it by how many came back." The sun filtered through the wooden slats, casting golden lines across the hay bales. Dust floated gently in the light like tiny ghosts finally at rest. Outside, Maria's voice crackled through an old radio. And in a world where violence often meets silence, two men in a forgotten corner of the country showed us another way. They didn't ask to be heroes. They didn't want the spotlight. They just wanted peace. And when peace was threatened, they stood their ground. Not to destroy, but to protect, to preserve, to remind us what still matters. Steven turned the dial down, just enough to let her voice blend into the background like a hymn. They stepped back into the sunlight, walking toward the field where new rows of vegetables were beginning to sprout. Not just survival crops anymore, real produce, real life. They were planting tomatoes this season, maybe even strawberries. "You think Emmy Lou will come help pick berries?" Steven asked. "She'll probably pick all the best ones and sneak 'em home in her boots," Keanu replied, amused. They walked in silence again, side by side, toward a future that no longer needed planning, only patience. They say the land remembers. Every footstep, every flame, every cry for justice, it all settles into the soil. And now, as the early sun stretches across the freshly rebuilt barn and glints off dew-kissed fences, you can almost hear the earth breathe easier. But this wasn't just about one farm. It was never just a fight over broken fences or scorched wood. This was a war for dignity, for the idea that two men, long forgotten by the world, still had a purpose, still had strength, and still had a voice. Steven and Keanu didn't come to this quiet valley for glory. They didn't arrive looking to prove anything. In fact, they were trying to lay the past to rest. But some battles don't stay buried. Some wrongs rise like smoke until someone decides to inhale the fire and walk straight through it. The world told them to sit down, stay quiet, let the system swallow them like it had so many others. But when the barn was set ablaze and a little girl risked her life to save a dog, something deeper ignited. It wasn't vengeance, it was conviction. The quiet, immovable kind. And when the gangs rolled in, armed with fear and fire, they didn't find scared old farmers. They found shadows waiting in the smoke. They found men who knew how to take pain and shape it into resolve. They found a porch that would not fall and hearts that would not waver. But here's what matters most. Keanu never raised his voice. Steven never once looked for a camera. No flashy speeches, no heroic poses, just the kind of bravery that builds itself quietly, one decision at a time. To stay, to resist, to protect. Not out of anger, but love. Love for a place they chose. Love for people who once looked the other way but now looked them in the eye with respect. And maybe even love for each other. Because in the ashes of everything that tried to burn them out, what remained wasn't ruin. It was brotherhood. And that's the kind of strength the world needs more of. There's a certain kind of silence that follows a storm. It's not the absence of sound. It's the presence of everything that was endured. Every broken plank, every scar on a weathered hand, every name remembered. The town still carries that silence. But now, it carries something else too. It carries pride. Not the pride that shouts in parades or beats its chest in the spotlight. This pride whispers in the way folks tip their hats again, in how children wave from the school bus window, in how Emmylou's parents stop by with fresh-baked cornbread just because they can. Just because they remember who ran into the fire when no one else did. Truth went public, yes. The evidence was undeniable. But real change didn't come from files and headlines. It came from the way people started seeing again, seeing who'd been beside them all along. Keanu walks the land like he's always belonged to it, like each fence post holds a chapter of something earned, not inherited. And Steven, with that quiet intensity, doesn't need a uniform anymore. He guards the community with a glance, with a well-timed nod, with the occasional raised eyebrow that says more than words ever could. There's no victory parade, no speeches, no medals. Just fences that stay mended now. Just peace, slow and patient, growing from ground once scorched. And in the evenings, they sit on the porch again. The same porch where ash once drifted like snow, where they spoke few words, but understood everything. A beat-up radio hums somewhere behind the screen door. A crow calls out from the cedar tree. Life, after all the noise, returns to something simple and sacred. Maria's story went national. It touched millions. But the real reward wasn't in the views or the retweets. It was in the letters that came flooding in. One from a retired Marine who said he'd been afraid to speak up in his own town. Another from a farmer in the Midwest who saw himself in Keanu's hands. A single mother in Oregon who said she finally understood the kind of quiet courage her late father had carried. These weren't fans. They were family. Strangers who finally felt seen. And maybe that's what stories like this are for. Not to elevate heroes, but to remind the rest of us we still can be. Because the world doesn't always reward those who stand up. Often, it punishes them. It labels them as troublemakers, calls them relics, tells them to move on. But sometimes, if you hold the line long enough, the world moves back to you. So here's the real question. Have you ever had to stand up for something when the world told you to sit down? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. Because stories like this don't end on porches or in headlines. They continue in the hearts of people brave enough to believe they still matter. Keanu once said it best, not in a film, not on a stage, but in a quiet moment only a few ever witnessed. Sometimes, the smallest stand shakes the biggest trees. And now, in the golden hush of morning, that truth lives in every corner of the valley. The barn that once burned now stands stronger than before, not because of nails or timber, but because of the hands that rebuilt it. The same hands that trembled with fear. The same hands that reached for neighbors they once ignored. This wasn't just a farm anymore. It had become a reminder that resistance rooted in kindness could still bloom. The soil under Keanu's boots remembers the nights of fire and betrayal, but it also remembers redemption. It remembers a man who chose restraint over revenge, a warrior who fought not with rage but with purpose. The kind of strength the world tries to forget. So the question now isn't whether the fight was worth it. The question is, what will you do when it's your turn? Will you speak when silence feels safer? Will you protect when everyone else looks away? Will you stand, even if you're standing alone? And maybe most importantly, who would you want beside you when the fires start? Let us know in the comments. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to fight for what's right, even when it cost you? I want to hear your story. And tell me, what kind of story should Keanu face next? Because maybe, just maybe, the next stand worth taking is yours.